Obviously, it looks a lot different than what we were here last Sunday. But there was a lot of work went in. I don't think the carpet even was here till Thursday. I think it was Thursday. They didn't get the carpet till like Thursday at 6 o'clock. So there was a lot of work that went in Thursday, Friday, and yesterday. They didn't leave till about 8 o'clock last night. So I felt bad for those guys because they had about a 6 hour drive home after they worked all day. I think Thursday night they worked like 1 o'clock in the morning. Come in here and work Friday, and I come in Friday, and I'll be honest with you, I wasn't sure. I thought we had a mess. When you stood upstairs and you looked down, it looked like you had two different colors of carpet. I'm like, these carpets are not going to blend. This is not going to work at all. I mean, and so, it was so bad. It was so bad. Preacher called Mohawk about it, or called his rep, and they called Mohawk rep about it. It was so bad. It looked so off. And but now that it's set up on the been set up for a couple of days, it actually you can't tell. You cannot tell. I should have took a picture of it so from upstairs so you could see the difference that it's made, because they put two of them down that first night, and then this one right through here was not down, and then they put this one, and it looked like this was different than this, and this was different than those, and I was like, this is going to be a disaster. But anyway, we thank the Lord that everything except for the balcony area up there is done, so I told Brother Jamie, I said, back before I moved up there in the sound room, no one ever sat up there in the balcony. But now that I'm up there, everyone wants to sit up there with me. What's that all about? So y'all didn't laugh as much as Brother Jamie. Brother Jamie thought it was funny, but anyway. But we only put 2 pews down, so I won't have much of a crowd up there with me today. So all right then. If you have your Bible, turn to 2 Kings chapter number 10. How you doing, Miss Jimmy? Good. Good. Do you like the new carpet smell? I do too. I actually kind of like a new carpet smell. Yeah. It's kind of like a new car smell. I'm too cheap to buy one, so every once in a while someone buys one, I just go over and smell what it smells like, because, I'm too cheap to buy new carpet too, so I'm just going to enjoy the new carpet here. But anyway, all right then. So 2 Kings chapter number 10, we are going to finish 2 Kings chapter number 10. And we may only have 1 or 2 more lessons here, and then after this, and then we are going to move on to something else. But for today, I want to read. We'll start reading in verse number 15. We're going to focus on around verse number 28 and beyond. But I just want to read again, because last week I really didn't talk a lot about Jehu. I talked more about, some of the other passages. But in verse number 15 it says, "And when he was departed thence, he lighted on Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him. And he saluted him and said to him, Is thine heart right, as my heart is with thy heart? And Jehonadab answered, It is. If it be, give me thine hand. And he gave him his hand, and he took him up to him into the chariot. And he said, Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." This verse right here was one of the reasons I wanted to read this passage. Again, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." So they made him ride in his chariot. And when he came to Samaria, he slew all that remained unto Ahab in Samaria, till he had destroyed him, according to the saying of the Lord, which he spake to Elijah. And Jehu gathered all the people together, and said unto them, Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu shall serve him much. Now therefore call unto me all the prophets of Baal, all his servants, and all his priests. Let none be wanting, for I have great sacrifice to do to Baal. Whosoever shall be wanting, he shall not live. But Jehu did it subtly, to the intent that he might destroy the worshippers of Baal. And Jehu said, Proclaim a solemn assembly for Baal. And they proclaimed it. And Jehu sent through all Israel, and all the worshippers of Baal came, so that there was not a man left that came not. And they came into the house of Baal, and the house of Baal was full from one end to another. And he said unto him that was over the vestry, Bring forth vestments for all the worshippers of Baal. And he brought them forth vestments. And Jehu went, and Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, into the house of Baal, and said unto the worshippers of Baal, Search and look, that there be here with you none of the servants of the Lord, but the worshippers of Baal only. And when they went in to offer sacrifice and burnt offerings, Jehu appointed 80 men without, and said, If any of the men whom I have brought into your hands escape, he that letteth him go, his life shall be for the life of him. And it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offerings, that Jehu said to the guard and to the captains, Go in and slay them. Let none come forth. And they smote them with the edge of the sword, and the guard and the captains cast them out and went into the city of the house of Baal. And they brought forth the images of the house of Baal and burned them. And they brake down the image of Baal and brake down the house of Baal and made it a draught house unto this day. Thus Jehu destroyed Baal out of Israel. And that's an awesome thing. In verse 29 it says, Howbeit, from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, Jehu departed not from after them, to wit, the golden calves that were in Bethel and that were in Dan. Verse 30, And the Lord said unto Jehu, Because thou hast done well in executing that which is right in mine eyes, and hast done unto the house of Ahab according to all that was in mine heart, thy children of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. Verse 31, But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart. For he departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel to sin. In those days the Lord began to cut Israel short, and Hazael smote them in all the coast of Israel. From Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites and the Reubenites and the Manassites, from Aror, which is by the river Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan. Now the rest of the acts of Jehu and all that he did, and all his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Jehu slept with his father, and they buried him in Samaria. And Jehoahaz his son reigned in his stead. And the time that Jehu reigned over Israel in Samaria was 28 years. So that was a lot of reading right there, but I wanted us to see the whole picture. Again, we understand because we've been looking at it for several weeks, but God chose Jehu. God chose Jehu many years before Jehu was ever anointed king. God chose Jehu when Elijah was still the prophet and told Elijah to anoint Jehu king over Israel. And then Elisha came on the scene, but even after Elisha came on the scene, there were still two sons of Ahab that were king before Jehu became king. And so finally it came to the place where Elisha sent that young man to go tell Jehu, you're going to be king, and he told him what he was supposed to do. And so Jehu was chosen by God. And when you read this passage right here, when you read up to verse number 28, you're like, I tell you what, that Jehu is a good man. That Jehu is a good man. That Jehu was really zealous for the Lord. That's what he said in that verse. He said, come see my zeal, in verse number 16. Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. And so I wanted to make sure to paint the whole picture. I wanted to make sure that we painted the whole picture, because absolutely, positively, what he did to Baal and Israel was right. It was right. I mean, it was what was supposed to be done. You see it, God talks about, it says in verse number 30, and the Lord said unto Jehu. So here he is talking to Jehu and said, hey, I want you to understand that what you did is right. But God, and I appreciate the fact that God shows you both sides of people in the Bible. You see the good and the bad. You see the good and the bad. I mean, even with David, a man after God's own heart. But God didn't say, well, you know what? Let's just not tell anyone what happened between David and Bathsheba. Let's just not tell anyone that Uriah was slain. That's not what God does. And I appreciate the fact, because, honestly, if all you ever read was good and not any of the bad, then you would feel hopeless. You would feel hopeless. You're like, man, these guys, I mean, they never seem to have a problem. All they ever did was had full faith in God, and they trusted God, and they did exactly what God wanted to, and they never wobbled on the axle. And so you wobble on the axle, but God showed, hey, here's a man after my own heart that made a mistake. And here's Solomon, the wisest man in the world, and look what happened to him. And not only is it, I don't want to call it, I don't want to say it's an encouragement to see other people fall, because but I believe you understand what I'm saying. It's not necessarily an encouragement, but it makes us understand that, hey, God knows who we are, and God understands. But there is a standard that God expects us to live to, and if we don't live to that standard, God is not going to just look away and say, oh, they were such a great person. And so here's Jehu, and Jehu did a great thing. He did a great thing. I mean, it was something that needed to be done. And either of the two sons of Ahab could have taken Baal out of Israel. And we talked about how the first one, he really wasn't, he really wasn't, that into the Baal worship, but they didn't take it out. And we talked about it last week. How when you have these things in your life, you have to utterly destroy them. If you don't utterly destroy them, they'll come back, and they'll come back, and they'll come back, and they'll come back. And your whole entire life, you will fight it. Why? Because you don't utterly destroy it. And so, but here in verse number 29, God again shows us the whole picture. In verse number 29, he says, howbeit. He's like, even though all this happened, even though all this good happened, howbeit. From the sins of Jeroboam, the sons of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Again, every time you read about Jeroboam, every time you read about him, that's the next statement. Who made Israel to sin. I mean, every time you read about it. And every king that took over on Israel's side, the kingdom was split. You had Judah and Israel. And they had a choice, Brother Jay. They had a choice. And it seemed like they never made the right choice. They might make the right choice when it come to Baal, but they never made the right choice when it come to those golden calves. And so here's Jehu. Here's Jehu with his opportunity. And he done so much. And he's got this zeal for the Lord, he said. But he comes to this place, and he didn't have as much zeal for the Lord as he thought he did. I mean, he did what he was supposed to do. But when it come down to doing right, it was easier to continue to let those golden calves stand. It was easier to just, Baal was the bad part. And them golden calves, they're not really hurting anybody. And he just made some excuses. And because of that, he didn't take them out. He didn't take them out of Israel. And so it says, God had to put this in here. He had to put this in here for us to see that Jehu's heart was not quite as right as it looked right. Had he stopped writing right there in verse number 28, and you never heard anything about it, you'd be like, I tell you what, that Jehu loved God. Oh, I tell you what, I wish I could serve God like Jehu served God. And I got to thinking about how many people do you know? And I thought about, I heard the conversation. There were some people having a conversation the other day, and one of the things that got brought up was about the good ground and the stone. The good ground. The seed was sown, and some was thrown stony ground, and some was thrown on good ground, and that stony ground, it looked good for a little while. That seed popped up and it was growing and it was blooming, and it looked good. But the sun came and hit it, and it withered and it was gone. And Brother Jay, I got to thinking about how many people live their whole life on a very short period of success. They live their life and they judge their Christianity based off of a very short period, a very short time where they were really zealous for God. They're really zealous, you hear people and you talk to them and they're like, well, back in 1986, I went on this soul winning thing, and I went and did this, and I went and done that, and our church did this. And I'm like, you realize that's 35 years ago. You realize that's 35 years ago. What have you done in the last 34 years? Well, back in 1986, and that's all they got to talk about. That's all they have to talk about. And again, if you talk to Jehu and said, hey, Jehu, do you love God? Well, of course I love God. Well, how dare you accuse me of not loving the Lord? Do you know what I did to Baal in Israel? Do you know that I took out Baal in Israel? And it had been hard to argue. It had been hard to argue that fact because that's 100% true. It's 100% true. But I'm going to use a term we've all heard. What have you done for me lately? What have you done for me lately? Once you had this great, huge achievement in your life, did you continue? And just going to church doesn't mean you've done these great things for God. It's good to go to church. It's right to go to church. It's good to be here Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. When you got the camp meeting, you got Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night for the tent meeting. It's good to be at every one of them services. I believe in Romans, it talks about a reasonable service. If you work a job, do they kind of expect you to be there? Like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, if you work a 5-day-a-week job. You know what I mean, Chris? I know there are different shifts. I think Justin works, some odd shifts. There are different shifts where, some places have swing shifts where they're 4 days on and so many days off and then bang, bang, back and forth. I don't think I'd like that. I never liked third shift. I hated third shift, because you go in on Sunday night, you go to church Sunday night, we would go out and eat, and then they'd go home and go to bed, and I'd go to work. And I didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy it at all. But they just had an expectation, Brother Croft, that I was going to be there. They just had this expectation that, Paul's going to be there. And if I wasn't there, they would want to know why. Hey, got a problem, sick right now, boom, boom, boom. But it's just a reasonable service. And I understand people get sick. Brother Croft said he was feeling bad, hadn't been sick in 3 years, but he was sick last week. I understand that. Been sick myself, and you just feel awful. I understand that. But it's a shame sometimes when you talk to someone and it's like, well, I was going to be there, but, and they just come up with these, I'm going to call them what they are, lame excuses. If someone showed up to work as often as some people show up to church, you'd be like, are you semi-retired? Are you semi-retired? Do you still work here? I mean, we make fun. We give people grief. You know, at work, I don't know how y'all are. Someone comes in, been off for a while, and they're like, well, who's this? Who's this guy? Well, what are you doing? Who's that driving so-and-so's van? You know, we got one guy, you know, he would go out on paternity leave, Brother Croft. He would go out on paternity leave. You know, most of us men in here are like, paternity leave, what's that? But nowadays, that's a thing. You know, it's like not only does the mom take off for 6-8 weeks from work, the dad's supposed to get 6-8 weeks as well. And so we got a guy that he'd take off a couple weeks. Now, he used his paternity leave to work on his old cars and stuff. He actually wasn't helping his wife, which is what's supposed to. Brother Bobby thought that was funny. But, you know, he'd finally come rolling back in, Chris, and we're like, well, who's this guy? What's he doing here? And so you sometimes you talk to people, and they've got this testimony of when they were really on fire for God. And you're like, tell me about when you got saved. And then they tell you this experience back in for me, I got saved in 1992. They tell you this experience back in 1992. And they were really zealous for the Lord for a little while. And they got rid of this, and they started doing that. And they were at church all the time. And they were doing all these things. And you're like, well, tell me about today. Well, what about today? Well, you know, what are you doing for God now? What have you done for Him lately? What have you done recently? Have you started to drift away? Are you a Jehu? Are you a Jehu that did this huge thing for God, and you're going to live the rest of your life saying, me and God are good because I did this thing for God way back when? Are you looking at it saying, look, I did this huge thing, and He did. It was huge. It was massive. I did this massive thing, and God spoke to me. Verse number 30, and the Lord said unto him, because thou hast done well. You're like, hey, God told me I was doing well. That's true. You know what I get evaluated? Every quarter at work. Every quarter I used to be sign off on it. Now I go on the computer and do it by a computer. But every quarter I get evaluated, Brother Jay, which you know because I used to do it. You remember back in the day, I used to bring my evaluation in. I made up a Sunday school lesson similar to my work evaluation, and you just checked up on yourself of how you were doing as a Christian. And every quarter, my boss evaluates me, and I get an email, and I have to go on, and I have to read his evaluation of how I'm doing at work. I've been there 22 years. I've been there 22 years. And you know what? I want that evaluation to always be good. I want that evaluation to say Paul is, you know, always trying to make the company money. He's a great asset to the company, and he's always constantly trying to learn new things. I've been there 22 years, Brother Croft. I know more than some of these new people will ever know. But it doesn't mean I'm satisfied. I can't be satisfied. We had a guy at work that just got retired. In the last 5 or 6 years, he basically said, you know, I've done my time, I'm good. And so, Brother Parks, this year they kind of just had to tell him, you know, we really appreciate what you did in the past, but we don't have a position for you here any longer. I don't want that to happen. I want to walk away on my own terms. I want to walk away and them say, hey, we sure wish you were still here. We don't want you to leave. Now let's turn it around to sitting in this church. You sitting in church and you're going back to 1977, 1984, or whenever. You're going way back in time. You're going in the Wayback Machine to tell what you did at Concord Baptist Church or what you did at whatever church you came from. But this is not 1977. It's 2021. Is it Dorcas? Is that who it was? Preacher preached that message on making yourself a felt necessity. Is that who that is? I think that's who that is. And I understand. I mean, this is the older generation class. I understand you're like, hey, I'm not as healthy as I used to be. I can't do. But you know what? I mean, everyone's just glad to see you. You can just be a testimony just by being here. You know, I mean, just Miss Jimmy being here is a blessing. Just my mother-in-law being here is a blessing. Just you being here is a blessing. You're like, well, I can't go out and knock on doors like that. We understand that. Understand that completely. But I'm saying, have you conscientiously made an effort to be part of the group? Or are you still living like Jehu on something you did 20 years ago? And you're like, God, you should be good. Again, God said, hey, you've done well in executing that which is right in mine eyes, and hast done unto the house of Ahab according to all that was in mine heart. Brother Parks, I'd like for God to say that about me, about something. I would like for him to say that about me, about something, Brother Jay. I would hope that one day he would say, hey, Paul, listen, I appreciate every Sunday school lesson you did where you put your whole heart into it and you said exactly the words. That's my prayer when I teach at Sunday school, is to only say the words he once said and not say a single word that he doesn't once said. That's my prayer. And I hope one day, Brother Croft, that he's like, look, when you taught Sunday school, you put your heart into it and you gave them what I wanted them to hear. I want that to be said about me. But Jehu had it said about him. He had it said about him. He's like, hey, you did everything that was in my heart. And he thought he could live on that. He thought that was good enough. He thought it was good enough, Chris. I mean, one of those conversations I heard this week was also, it was a man talking about his ordination. And he was talking about there were 3 other men that were ordained the same time he was. None of those other 3 men are preaching right now, Chris. They've thrown their ministry away. Whether they just walked away from it, Brother Parks, whether morally they've destroyed themselves so that they cannot have a ministry, or whatever, but they took that ministry for granted. If you would have told them at that ordination service, hey, there's 4 of you standing in front of me, in 20 years, only one of you will still be preaching. There's no way. There's no way. That's not going to happen. If you don't, and my kids are up there, so we've got a wide age range in here. We got 12 years old all the way up in our 80s in this room right here today. And if my 12-year-old doesn't make a conscious effort to serve God, you know what he's going to do, Jay? He's not going to serve God. And if you in your 80s don't say, it's still important for me to serve God in my old age, you're just not going to serve him. And people will look and say, hey, there's Brother So-and-so. I remember when Brother So-and-so. I don't want it to just be a remember when. Do you want people to be like, remember when? Remember when? No. You want it to be, hey, there's Brother So-and-so. He's still after it after all these years. You got Brother Charlie still thinking about going to the mission field in Mexico. His wife's gone. His kids are gone. And he's like, you know what? I think I may just go back. I may just go back to Mexico. I mean, we all look at Brother Charlie like the man is the Energizer Bunny. I mean, he just goes and goes and goes and goes. But it's a whole lot better than the guy that went to the mission field for a year and come back off the mission field for a year and he's like, well, I'm good. Tell me about yourself. Well, I was a missionary. And again, God would commend you for being a missionary. God's like, hey, you went to that foreign field, you did my work, but what are you doing today? You don't want the howbeit to be, when God talks about you, you don't want the howbeit. When we read in Revelation, he's like, hey, here, I know your works, and these are your works, but I got somewhat against you. You don't want that. But it's a conscious choice on your part. God doesn't change. Jehu made a conscious choice. Baal bad. The sins of Jeroboam, them 2 golden calves, nah. How far are you willing to go with God? Well, I got the bad stuff out of my life. I got the bad stuff out. But there's this other stuff that God calls sin, but I don't think it's that bad. How far are you willing to go with God? Are you willing to just get the bad stuff out? And then you can sit and you can compare yourself and you can look and say, well, I did more than that person. I did more than that person. I did more than that person. The standard is not Brother Tyrone. The standard is not Brother Parks. The standard is not even Brother Charlie. The standard is God and His Word. And what is your relationship with God? What is your relationship with God like? Do you have to go back to 1992 and be like, I tell you what, I really gave up a lot? Did you really? I gave up a lot. And I started doing this and I started doing that, and I went to church services and went to camp meetings and I went this and I traveled and I did all this stuff and I went out and I witnessed to people and I told people about God and I did all this stuff. When did you stop? When did you stop? When did you make the conscious choice that it wasn't important anymore? When did you make the conscious choice that, I did so much for God back in the day that, what's the point of me doing anything else? That was Jehu's attitude. Jehu said, hey, I did so much for you, God. We're good. God made Jehu a promise. He said, hey, I'm going to let your children to the 4th generation sit on the throne. To the 4th generation. I'm like, man, that's pretty good. You think about every one of us, we just want our children to be right with God. But can you imagine if you own a company or something like that, and you're like, hey, this company's going to be successful, so I'll show you. In chapter number 13, verse number 1, in the 23rd year of Joash, the son of Ahaziah, king of Judah, Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, began to reign over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 17 years. 17 years. But look at verse number 2. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, and followed the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which made Israel to sin. He departed not therefrom, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. In chapter 13, verse number 10. In the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, began Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, to reign over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 16 years. So now we got 33 years worth of them in there. Then in chapter number 14, verse number 23. In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria, and reigned 41 years. Verse 24, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, and departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. 41 years. And then in chapter 15, verse number 8, In the 38th year of Azariah, king of Judah, did Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, reign over Israel and Samaria 6 months. Verse number 9. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, as his fathers had done. He departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. So when you add up Jehu's 28 years and the rest of his kids, it's 102 years, give or take. So I don't know, it doesn't give months, but it could be anywhere from 102 years to 106 years they reigned over Israel. And Brother Jay, God said every single one of them did evil in the sight of the Lord. Jehu had one huge victory. One huge victory. And it was a huge victory. And from that moment on, for 100 and some years, I mean, you think about it. This is 2021. In 1921, 100 years ago, well, just coming out of World War I. I mean, World War I, we don't even think about World War I. No one even talks about World War I. They talk about World War II. They talk about Vietnam, but they don't talk about World War I. That's 100 years ago. 100 years of people doing evil. Why? Because the father of that generation, the father of that group, chose not to serve God. He said, you know what? I did something huge for God. That's enough. And because he continued in the sins of Jeroboam, and again, I hate to see history repeat itself, but how often does history repeat itself? How often do you see that here Jeroboam his whole kingdom was taken out? Why? Because he created these calves and this sin. And then the next man up, Baasha, guess what? God's like, you're not going to serve me either. And then we have Ahab come in a little bit later, and when Ahab comes in, he brings in this Baal worship. So, now we brought something worse in. So now God ought to be satisfied when we get rid of the worst thing, but God still was not pleased with that sin of Jeroboam and worshiping them calves. And all Jehu, had he really, in verse number 16, had he really been zealous for God, he could have did what eventually Josiah had to do, which was not only destroy Baal, but destroy those golden calves as well. But he chose not to, because he said, look what I did. Look back there. And you couldn't argue with it. But I'll tell you someone who could argue with it. God could argue with it. God could argue with it and say, hey, I don't care what you did in 1997. I don't care how much money you gave in 1997. What are you doing today? Are you doing what you're supposed to today? Is there something that I've dealt with you about in your life that you're like, God, I got rid of this. Really? Are you going to, really? I can't believe you. You asked me to get rid of this big thing. I got rid of this big thing. This is just a little sin. What little sin have you kept? What little sin have you kept as your little pet sin? And you're like, you know what? God understands because he said I did good. He said I did good. Brother Chris, if I said, you know what, I've done so much for the company I work for, I've done so much, I don't have to do another thing for them. That I may be able to ride it out for a little while, Brother Jay. I may be able to ride it out for a little while. But you know what? They're expecting me to do something for them in 2021, just like when I hired in 1999. And I expect something from them, Brother Jay. I expect a paycheck every 2 weeks to be direct deposited in my account. And they expect me to show up to work. And they expect me when I show up to work to look like I'm supposed to look and act like I'm supposed to act. And if you can work for a company that can expect you to do that, why on earth do you think you can't serve a God that expects you to show up when you're supposed to show up, look like you're supposed to look, and act like you're supposed to act? And not say, well, 20 years ago I looked like I was supposed to look, and talked like I was supposed to talk, and act like I was supposed to act. God, me and you were good. It just doesn't fly. It wouldn't fly at your job. If you were the owner of the company, would you put up with that? No. Even if it was your own child. Even if it was your own child. I worked for my dad. You know what? People are like, oh, it must be nice to work for your dad. Yeah, it was real nice. Because at midnight, whenever a load needed tarped, he didn't call one of the other employees. He went and woke me up and said, hey, I need you to go out to the lumber mill right now and get up there because someone's coming in. They're going to hook to that trailer, and I need you to go out there and tarp that load. So at midnight, Brother Jay, I'd drive out to the lumber mill, one eye open, and I'd back up to the thing. I'd jump up in the bed of my truck, get on the ladder, climb up on the ladder, and roll the tarp out in the sawdust, and then I'd get down, hook all the gummies, get back in my truck, drive home, and try and lay back down because I had to get up and be at work the next day. It sure was great to work for my dad. Now, there were perks. I'm not going to lie. There were perks. There were. But just because you're God's child, because he saved you, didn't give you a license to sin. It didn't give you a license to live any way you wanted to. And if you truly love God, you're not just going to say, see my zeal for the Lord. I'm going to say, show me your zeal. And don't just show me what you did all them years ago. What are you doing now? What are you doing now? What do you got going on now? What's different about you now? In verse 31 it says, but Jehu, he took no heed. Again, and we'll get to it maybe not next week, but the week after. But Jehu serves for 28 years. Jehoahaz serves for 17 years. That's 45 years. And Joash, which is his son, that's who Elisha is talking to. The last time the Bible talks about Elisha being the prophet that he was. There's a 45-year span right there where we don't really hear a lot about Elisha. But I'll guarantee that Jehu knew, because it says he took no heed. If you don't know, then it doesn't matter. But if I tell you not to do something, you have to choose not to. It says he took no heed. It means he chose not to listen. He said, nah. It says he took no heed to walk in the... So somebody told Jehu, you're not right. Somebody looked at Jehu and said, you are not right in what you're doing. And Jehu's like, do you know what I did? Do you know what I did? Do you know what I did to Baal? Do you know what I did for Israel? Do you know what? And the Bible says he took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord, God of Israel, with all his heart. For he departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel to sin. How much of your heart does God have right now? How much of your heart does God have right now? Jeroboam could point to a little spot in his heart and say, that is God's. I gave that spot to God, and I did everything I could with that little part. But the Bible talks continually about serving God with your whole heart. How much of your heart does God have at this moment? How much of your heart is still yours? It's still yours. Before I got saved, Brother Croft, I'm like, hey, there's some things I want to do. A young man, I was probably in the 7th or 8th grade, we're sitting in a computer class in middle school, and a boy was talking to me about getting saved. I said, I got some things I want to do. I didn't do those things. I ended up getting saved at 16 a couple years later. I never did those things. But Brother Jay, there are people that are saved as the Apostle Paul now that gave their heart fully to God. Whatever year you gave your heart fully to God, but God doesn't have your whole heart right now. You've left your first love. You've only given God a piece of your heart now. You've only given God that little part. And you forgot the joy that you had and how happy you were when God had your whole heart. When you first got saved, you're the happiest person you knew. Well, you're just so zealous for God, and you're doing those things for God, and you're as happy as anybody. But the cares of this world come in, and things start coming in, and next thing you know, God's only got a little piece of your heart. And you're not happy anymore. And it's not God's fault you're not happy. It's your fault. Because you can't look back and say, like Jehu, look at the great thing that I did. Jehu would have been great had he just chose to serve God with his whole heart. He had the power. He had the ability. No one would have stopped him had he destroyed them golden calves. I mean, you got people saying, 2 kings couldn't stand before him. What are we going to do? 2 kings couldn't stand before him. What are we going to do to him? And all he had to do was serve God with his whole heart and take them things out. And a whole 100 years, 4 kings, it would have completely changed how Israel, that northern kingdom, was. But no. God had to say, howbeit. Howbeit. And if God were giving an evaluation today on each of our hearts, if we started in the back corner back there with your daughter, Brother Tyrone, or we started up there and said, God, tell us about them. Well, they've done this for me and they've done that for me, and I'm so happy for them. Howbeit. Do you have a howbeit? Is your salvation a howbeit experience? I look back and say, here's where it was really good, but now this is where we're at. This is where we're at, and it's howbeit. I don't want that. Brother Tyrone, the songwriter said, prone to wonder, Lord, I feel it. We all have those times. But you have 2 choices when those times come. You can justify them and just say, I'm going to live there, and God will be pleased with what I did in the past. Or you say, you know what, I'm never going to be satisfied. I'm never going to be satisfied. I'm never going to be satisfied. I want a good report from God every time. Every time he evaluates me, I want a good report. Thank you.